The streets of Jerusalem shimmered in the fierce sunlight of a restless summer, but beneath the surface of the holy city, an unquiet storm was gathering. In the year 66 of the Common Era, Judea was a province on edge, a land caught between devotion to its God and the crushing weight of Rome's empire. Imagine the scene: soldiers in gleaming armor marching through narrow streets, their Latin commands echoing off the stone walls, while Jewish merchants and farmers watched with clenched jaws, their hearts filled with resentment. This was no ordinary tension between ruler and ruled. This was a people whose faith taught them that no king, but God could rule over Israel, now bound under the dominion of a foreign power whose legions worshipped Jupiter and Mars. The collision was not merely political, but cosmic. Something had to give. For years, whispers of rebellion had spread like sparks in dry grass. Taxes were heavy, the Roman procurators often corrupt and brutal, and their contempt for local traditions ignited fury in the synagogues and marketplaces. The people remembered their ancient kingdom, their prophets, their temple in Jerusalem, the dwelling place of the divine presence. To them, Roman authority was not just domination, it was desecration. Yet the empire tolerated little dissent, and Judea, though small, was a critical province, lying at the crossroads between the Mediterranean world and the great eastern territories of Parthia and beyond. To lose it, even to unrest, would be unthinkable for Rome. And yet, from the seeds of discontent, rebellion was about to erupt in flames. It began with small acts of defiance, as if the population were testing the limits of imperial patience. Priests refused sacrifices on behalf of the emperor, a symbolic insult that reverberated across the empire. Bands of zealots roamed the countryside, attacking Roman patrols and collaborators, proclaiming that the God of Israel would once again rise to deliver his people from oppression. The message resonated with a people steeped in memories of the Maccabees, who just 2 centuries before had driven out the Seleucid Greeks and rededicated the temple. If their ancestors had triumphed with God's help, why not now? Rome, in all its majesty, was but a beast of clay before the will of the Almighty. The breaking point came in Caesarea, a city emblematic of Roman power. Built by Herod the Great, it housed a large pagan population, and tensions between Greeks and Jews often boiled over. One day, when provocations spiraled into violence, the Roman governor Florus chose not to protect the Jewish population, but to side with their rivals. His soldiers plundered the temple treasury in Jerusalem under the pretext of unpaid taxes. Outrage exploded like thunder. In Jerusalem, the people rose in fury, driving Florus and his men out of the city. The Roman garrison on the Temple Mount was slaughtered when they attempted to flee. For the first time, the unimaginable had happened. Judea had openly defied Rome. News spread like wildfire across the countryside. Villages armed themselves. Zealots proclaimed the dawn of deliverance, and the Sanhedrin, the Jewish council, was forced to reckon with the unstoppable tide. Even moderate leaders who might have preferred compromise saw no turning back. War had begun, not only against Roman rule but against those within Judea who were seen as collaborators, aristocrats and priests too eager to appease the empire. It was not merely a revolt, it was a revolution of faith and identity. The first Roman response was swift but underestimating. Cestius Gallus, the governor of Syria, marched with a substantial force to crush the rebels and restore order. He advanced into Judea and even besieged Jerusalem itself. For a moment it seemed the uprising would be strangled in its cradle, yet the defenders fought with a ferocity that stunned the legionaries. In a shocking reversal, Gallus was forced to retreat, harassed relentlessly through the narrow passes by Jewish fighters who slaughtered thousands of Roman soldiers and seized vast stores of weapons and supplies. To the rebels, this was not just victory, it was a sign from heaven. Rome had been humiliated, and God's hand seemed visible in the triumph. The zealots declared the revolt unstoppable. Songs of liberation echoed through Jerusalem's streets. It was said that angels themselves were fighting for Israel. But Rome was not an enemy easily humbled twice. The news of Gallus's defeat reached Emperor Nero, who could not allow the empire's authority to crumble on the fringes. He summoned one of his most capable generals, a man destined to carve his name into history, Vespasian. Alongside his son Titus, Vespasian gathered a massive force. Tens of thousands of Roman soldiers, auxiliaries from across the provinces, siege engines, and the cold discipline that had forged the empire. For the Jews, the storm was gathering, though in those early years of victory they scarcely understood its full scale. Meanwhile, within Jerusalem, triumph began to sour into factional strife. Different groups vied for power: zealots, priests, moderates, and warlords. Each believed they fought for God, yet each distrusted the others. Instead of unity, the city was torn by rivalries. In the countryside, resistance turned savage, with raids, assassinations, and massacres staining the land with blood. The revolt had begun in fire, but that fire was now consuming Judea from within. Still, for the common people, hope endured, anchored in faith and memory. They clung to the belief that the God who once split the Red Sea could yet humble Rome. And so, as Vespasian's legions prepared their inexorable advance, Judea braced for a war that would decide not only its political fate, but the destiny of its people for centuries to come. The revolt had begun in defiance, with a triumph against all odds. Yet in the shadows, tragedy loomed, for the empire was relentless, and Jerusalem was a city destined for siege. When Vespasian finally marched into Judea in 67 CE, the air trembled with dread. His army was not a punitive detachment like Gallus's ill-fated force. It was the full might of Rome descending upon a rebellious province. He commanded 3 legions, supported by auxiliaries from Syria, Arabia, and other provinces. With him came his son Titus, eager to prove himself, and together they embodied the relentless will of the empire. Their approach was methodical, as if a vast machine of conquest had been set in motion, each cog turning with precise discipline. To the rebels of Judea, it must have felt as though an unstoppable storm cloud had rolled over the land. Their first target was Galilee, the northern region where Jewish resistance had rallied under fiery leaders. Here stood one of the most enigmatic figures of the revolt, a man who would straddle the line between participant and chronicler: Joseph ben Mattityahu, better known to history as Josephus. Born into a priestly family in Jerusalem, Josephus had been trained in the traditions of his people, but was also steeped in Greek learning. At just 30 years of age, he was entrusted with command of the defense of Galilee. For Josephus, this was more than duty. It was destiny. He saw himself as fighting not only for his people, but for the very covenant that bound them to God. Yet he was also shrewd enough to recognize the monstrous power that Rome wielded. Vespasian began his campaign with cold calculation. The Roman legions advanced like a tide, securing strongholds, cutting supply lines, and reducing fortified cities one by one. Sepphoris, a major city in Galilee, quickly surrendered to the Romans, unwilling to share Jerusalem's defiance. But other towns stood firm, and among them none was more determined than Jotapata, a hilltop fortress under Josephus's command. The siege of Jotapata became a grim testament to both Roman discipline and Jewish desperation. Vespasian encircled the city, his engineers constructing siege ramps and towers, their engines hurling stones and darts that battered the defenders day and night. Inside the walls, Josephus rallied his men with words of faith and courage, proclaiming that God would not abandon his people. They fought with every means they had, raining down stones, arrows, and boiling oil upon the attackers. For 47 days Jotapata held out, an island of resistance against the empire. Yet Rome's patience was inexhaustible. The walls cracked under relentless assault, and finally the legions surged inside. What followed was a massacre, as thousands of defenders and civilians were slaughtered. Josephus himself, caught in the chaos, sought refuge in a cave with a group of survivors. According to his own account, when his companions resolved to commit suicide rather than surrender, he employed cunning to avoid death, persuading the last survivor to draw lots with him so that he alone would be left alive. Captured and brought before Vespasian, Josephus displayed extraordinary audacity. He declared that God had revealed to him a prophecy: Vespasian would soon become emperor of Rome. At first, the general dismissed him as a desperate trickster. But when the prophecy began to circulate among the soldiers, it sparked curiosity and even respect. For the Romans, omens and prophecies carried weight, and Josephus, now spared, became not only a prisoner but eventually a confidant. From that moment he would walk a strange path, no longer a commander of Jewish resistance, but a chronicler of its destruction, writing the very history that would echo through the centuries. The fall of Jotapata sent a chilling message across Judea. Resistance was possible, even heroic, but Rome's might was unyielding. Vespasian continued his campaign, moving systematically from town to town, reducing strongholds with brutal efficiency. Tarichi, Gamala, and other fortresses in Galilee fell one after another, their defenders slaughtered or enslaved, their cities left in ruins. The Roman legions advanced like a plague of iron, consuming everything before them. Refugees streamed southward, carrying tales of horror to Jerusalem. The city, already torn by factional rivalries, swelled with the displaced, fueling both despair and fanaticism. And yet, for all its suffering, the revolt endured. The Zealots and other factions in Jerusalem refused to surrender, convinced that the God of Israel would yet deliver them. To them, the fall of Galilee was but a trial of faith, a crucible through which the nation would be purified. The temple still stood gleaming in the sun, its sacrifices continuing daily. As long as the sanctuary endured, hope could not be extinguished. Meanwhile, fate intervened in a way that would reshape not only the war, but the destiny of the empire itself. In 68 CE, news arrived that Emperor Nero was dead, his reign collapsing in flames of scandal and revolt. The empire was thrown into chaos, the year of the 4 emperors, as rivals vied for power in Rome. Vespasian, the steady general campaigning in Judea, suddenly found himself drawn into the maelstrom. Josephus's prophecy hung over him like a mantle. In 69 CE, the legions in the east proclaimed him emperor, and he left Judea in the hands of his son Titus. The war, already grim, would now be prosecuted with new intensity. For Titus carried not only his father Es' command, but the expectation of proving himself worthy of imperial succession. The son would now finish what the father had begun, and the stage was set for the most terrible chapter of all, the siege of Jerusalem. As Titus gathered his forces and prepared to march on the holy city, Jerusalem itself was spiraling into chaos. The defenders, far from united, were consumed by civil war. Zealots and rival factions turned their swords against each other, burning food supplies in their madness, convinced that only divine intervention could save them. The city that should have been a fortress of faith was instead a cauldron of division, and as the Roman legions closed in, the fate of Jerusalem hung suspended between rebellion and tragedy, as though the heavens themselves were preparing to bear witness to its fall. When Titus approached Jerusalem in the spring of 70 CE, he found not a city united in resistance, but a kingdom devouring itself. Within its massive walls, 3 rival factions waged a brutal civil war. Zealots led by John of Gischala radicals commanded by Simon bar Giora, and another faction under Eleazar ben Simon, all claimed to fight for God and for freedom. Yet their mutual hatred blinded them to the greater threat that loomed outside. The streets ran with Jewish blood before a single Roman ram had touched the gates. In their fury, the factions even burned vast stores of grain and provisions, ensuring that famine would soon stalk the city. Jerusalem, instead of preparing for survival, was preparing for ruin. Outside, the legions gathered in grim discipline. Titus commanded 4 full legions, with auxiliaries swelling his army to perhaps 70,000 men. His camp bristled with siege engines, towers, and catapults, the finest instruments of war the ancient world could produce. From the Mount of Olives to the western hills, the city was encircled by steel and fire. For the Romans, this was not only a military operation but a statement of imperial might. No province, however rebellious, could defy the empire and survive. The first assaults struck the outer defenses. Jerusalem was a fortress city, girded by 3 concentric walls and crowned by the Temple Mount. The Romans advanced methodically, battering gates and towers with their rams, hurling stones that crashed through rooftops and setting fire to wooden structures. The defenders fought back with desperate ferocity, raining arrows and stones, rolling burning torches onto siege engines, and making sorties to disrupt the enemy's lines. In these first clashes, Jewish courage astonished even their foes. But discipline and engineering wore down valor, and one by one the outer defenses began to crumble. Inside, suffering mounted. With supplies destroyed by factional madness, famine tightened its grip. Mothers watched their children wither, and in dark corners whispers told of cannibalism, a horror that even the Romans later recorded with shuddering disbelief. Yet still the factions fought each other, unwilling to yield unity even in the face of annihilation. Priests continued their daily sacrifices at the temple, their prayers rising to heaven amid the screams of the starving, as if ritual could still anchor a world collapsing into ruin. Titus, for his part, attempted at first to spare the temple. Josephus, now serving as his interpreter and advisor, was sent to the walls to plead with the defenders. He urged them to surrender, to save the sanctuary from destruction. But the rebels mocked him, calling him a traitor, pelting him with stones and insults. To them the temple was untouchable, a fortress of God immune to Roman fire. Yet their defiance was not matched with wisdom, and their rage only hardened the resolve of the legions. The siege lengthened, and Titus ordered the construction of a massive wall encircling the entire city, sealing off every escape. No food could enter, no soul could leave. The city was a trap, a coffin slowly being nailed shut. Starvation claimed thousands, their bodies piled high in the streets, unburied because none had the strength to carry them to their graves. The stench of death clung to the city, mingling with smoke and dust, choking both defender and invader alike. At last, the Romans breached the second wall, then pressed toward the Antonia fortress, the great stronghold overlooking the temple. The defenders fought with unyielding faith, convinced that the sanctuary of God could not fall. For days the two sides clashed around the sacred courts, stones and fire raining down, cries of prayer and agony mingling in the tumult, and then, in a moment that would forever sear itself into history, the temple itself was consumed. Accounts differ on how the fire began, whether by a soldier's torch against Titus' orders or by the fury of battle. But once ignited, the flames spread uncontrollably. Gold from the ceiling melted and ran like rivers between the stones. The sanctuary, once the jewel of Judea, the dwelling place of God's presence, blazed against the night sky. Priests perished at the altar, clutching sacred vessels, while rebels and civilians alike were cut down amid the inferno. Titus, watching the destruction, is said to have raised his hands in despair, unable or unwilling to halt the chaos. But the momentum of destruction was unstoppable. The Second Temple, the heart of Jewish faith and identity, was reduced to ash and rubble. The slaughter that followed defies comprehension. Tens of thousands were killed, their blood mingling with the smoke that rose to the heavens. Those who survived were enslaved, paraded later in Rome as spoils of triumph, their sacred treasures carried through the streets beneath the Arch of Titus, where the menorah and trumpets of the temple were displayed as trophies of empire. Jerusalem itself was left in ruins, its walls razed, its population shattered. The city that had once been the glory of Israel was no more, yet the fall of Jerusalem was not merely a tragedy of stone and flame. It was a rupture in history, a turning point that reshaped the destiny of a people. The temple had stood at the center of Jewish life for centuries, the place where heaven and earth met, where sacrifices bound the nation to its God. With its destruction, that world ended. The faith of Israel would survive, but in exile, in synagogues and texts, in prayers uttered across distant lands. The revolt, born in defiance and hope, had ended in fire and desolation. As the smoke of the temple drifted into the sky, carrying with it the cries of a nation, Titus prepared to return to Rome, leaving behind a land scarred by war. Yet even in the ashes, pockets of resistance endured. For though Jerusalem was gone, the spirit of rebellion was not yet extinguished. In the deserts by the Dead Sea, one final fortress still stood, defiant against the empire, Masada. In the shadow of Jerusalem's smoking ruins, the revolt staggered on, no longer a united war but a scattered defiance. The land was scarred and silent, its villages burned, its fields abandoned, its people dead or enslaved. Yet one stronghold remained untouched, perched high above the Judean desert, on a plateau so steep it seemed carved by the hand of God himself. This was Masada, the fortress built by Herod the Great decades earlier, a palace fortress of stone rising over the desolate landscape, commanding the Dead Sea below. Here, a band of zealots made their last stand, determined to resist Rome to the very end. The leader of these survivors was Eleazar ben Yair, a nephew of one of the earlier rebel commanders. To his followers, he was not merely a commander but a prophet of freedom, a voice proclaiming that slavery to Rome was worse than death. Nearly 1,000 men, women, and children had fled to Masada after Jerusalem's fall, including warriors and families alike. They fortified the heights, storing provisions, collecting rainwater, and preparing themselves for a siege. To them, Masada was not only a refuge but a symbol, a last bastion of defiance where the spirit of Israel could outlive the empire's cruelty. For the Romans, however, the existence of Masada was intolerable. The province had to be pacified completely. No pocket of resistance could remain. And so the 10th Legion, hardened by the sack of Jerusalem, marched into the desert to extinguish the last flame of rebellion. To assault Masada was no easy task. The fortress rose sheer from the desert floor, its cliffs forbidding, its summit nearly unassailable. Yet Rome did not shrink before challenges. Where cliffs barred ascent, engineers would build. The legionaries set to work with their unyielding discipline, quarrying stone, hauling timber, and constructing a massive earthen ramp on the western side of the plateau. Slowly, day by day, the ramp rose, a mountain built by human hands creeping toward the summit, where the zealots watched with growing dread. Inside the fortress, Eleazar spoke to his people, urging them to prepare for the inevitable. He reminded them of the fate of Jerusalem, the desecration of the temple, the rivers of blood spilled by Roman swords. To fall into their hands, he warned, was to be enslaved, humiliated, stripped of dignity and faith. Better, he declared, to choose death freely than to live as chattel beneath the yoke of Rome. His words echoed the ancient stories of Israel's martyrs, of those who had chosen faith and freedom over submission. His followers listened, torn between the instinct to survive and the call of honor. Day by day, the Roman ramp grew higher, until at last the engines of war could be wheeled into place. The defenders, gazing down from their walls, saw their doom approaching in the inexorable rise of wood and stone. When the battering ram began its thunder against Masada's walls, the end was certain. Yet that night, Eleazar gathered his people and delivered his final, most haunting address. He spoke of freedom, of dignity, of the covenant with God. He declared that to surrender their wives and children to slavery would be a fate worse than annihilation. And so he urged them to embrace death as a final act of defiance, to rob the Romans of victory, to leave the conquerors nothing but ashes and silence. The decision was made. In the darkness of the night, families embraced one last time, tears mingling with whispered prayers. Fathers took the lives of their wives and children, and then of one another, until only a handful remained. Finally, the last men drew lots, each killing his comrade, until only one was left. He set fire to the storerooms and the palace, then fell upon his own sword. When the Romans breached the walls at dawn, expecting a desperate battle, they found only smoke, silence, and the bodies of the dead. Masada had chosen death over submission. Josephus, our only detailed source, tells us that 2 women and a few children, who had hidden in a cistern, survived to recount the final words of Eleazar and the fate of the defenders. Whether every detail of this account is true, we may never know, but the story became a legend, a symbol of ultimate resistance, of a people who refused to yield even in the face of overwhelming power. For the Romans, Masada was another victory, another province pacified. For the Jews, it was both a tragedy and a testament, a last flicker of defiance that burned even as it was extinguished. The revolt, which had begun with hope and triumph against Gallus, ended here in silence and ashes. Judea was crushed, its cities ruined, its people scattered. Tens of thousands were enslaved, carried to Rome to labor in mines and households, or forced to march in chains behind Titus's triumphal chariot. The temple's sacred vessels were displayed as trophies, gleaming symbols of Rome's dominion. Jerusalem itself was left desolate, a city without a temple, a nation without a center. Yet from the ruins of revolt, something new would emerge. Deprived of their sanctuary, the Jewish people turned to their scriptures, their synagogues, their teachers. Faith adapted, transformed and endured, carried into exile but never extinguished. The revolt had failed in arms, but it had forged a resilience that no empire could destroy. For Rome, the war was a display of power, a warning to all provinces that rebellion meant annihilation. For the Jews, it was the greatest tragedy of their ancient history, yet also the crucible from which their identity would survive. As the sun rose over Masada's silent ruins, casting long shadows across the desert, it seemed that Rome had triumphed utterly. And yet, in the prayers whispered by survivors scattered across the empire, in the yearning for Jerusalem that echoed for centuries, in the memory of defiance and martyrdom, the revolt lived on. The story of Judea's rebellion, its siege and its tragedy, would echo long after the legions marched away, leaving behind a land forever changed. In the aftermath of Masada, silence fell over Judea. The once proud cities of the land lay in ruins, their marketplaces deserted, their sanctuaries desecrated. Jerusalem was a heap of stones, its temple reduced to ashes, the very heart of the nation torn from its chest. For Rome, the war was over. The province was pacified, the rebellion extinguished, and the empire's authority reaffirmed. But beneath the surface, the war's consequences rippled outward, shaping not only the fate of Judea, but the course of world history. For the Romans, the victory was both triumph and warning. Titus returned to Rome in glory, leading captives and treasures through the streets in a dazzling procession. The Arch of Titus still stands today, its carvings immortalizing the menorah and sacred vessels borne away from the temple. Yet behind the spectacle lay a grim truth. Judea had cost Rome dearly. Tens of thousands of soldiers had died, and the legions had been forced into one of their bloodiest campaigns of the century. The revolt revealed both the might of Rome and the vulnerabilities that seethed beneath its grandeur. For all its legions and engineering, the empire could not command loyalty. It could only enforce obedience, and obedience came at the price of rivers of blood. For the Jewish people, the revolt was devastation beyond measure. The temple was gone, and with it the sacrificial system that had bound their faith for centuries. The priesthood, once central to their worship, was scattered and powerless. The land that had been the stage for their covenant with God was now a wasteland, patrolled by foreign soldiers, its population enslaved or exiled. Yet in this desolation, a new form of resilience emerged. The rabbis, survivors of war and exile, began to shape a Judaism no longer dependent on the temple, but rooted in study, prayer, and community. The Torah, once housed within the sanctuary, became the sanctuary itself, carried wherever Jews wandered. The synagogue replaced the altar, and memory replaced sacrifice. Out of tragedy was born a faith capable of surviving dispersion across continents, able to endure centuries of exile and oppression without losing its essence. The destruction of the temple was not the end of Judaism, but the beginning of its transformation. The revolt also left behind a legacy of stories, legends, and memories that echoed through the generations. Josephus, the priest-turned-historian, recorded the war in painstaking detail, his writings ensuring that the world would remember both the courage and the tragedy of Judea's last stand. To some, he was a traitor, a man who saved his life by serving the conquerors. To others, he was the chronicler who preserved a memory that might otherwise have been lost. Through him, we know of Jotapata, of Jerusalem's famine, of Masada's haunting end. His words became the bridge between antiquity and memory, a reminder of both heroism and folly. For centuries afterward, Jews scattered across the world carried the memory of the revolt in their prayers. Each year, as they mourned the destruction of the temple on Tisha B'Av, they recalled not only the flames that consumed the sanctuary, but the faith that endured beyond it. In their songs and laments, they whispered the name of Jerusalem, vowing never to forget. Even in distant lands, in Babylon, in Spain, in Poland, they ended their prayers with the yearning cry, "Next year in Jerusalem." The revolt, though crushed, had not destroyed the longing for Zion. And yet the revolt was not the last. In later generations, new uprisings would rise, from the Kitos War under Trajan to the mighty rebellion of Bar Kokhba under Hadrian. Each was driven by the same unyielding faith, the same refusal to accept the empire's dominion. Each ended in devastation, yet each also carried forward the same flame of identity that Rome could never extinguish. The Great Revolt was the first, the most devastating and perhaps the most formative of them all, setting the stage for centuries of defiance and endurance. From the perspective of history, the revolt stands as both warning and inspiration. It is the story of a small nation that dared to challenge the mightiest empire of its age, fueled by faith in a God greater than any earthly power. It is also the story of how disunity, fanaticism, and internal strife can turn hope into ruin. The courage of the defenders shines brightly, but so too does the tragedy of their divisions, their inability to unite in the face of an enemy that exploited every weakness. It is a tale both heroic and tragic, one that speaks not only to the past, but to the eternal human struggle between freedom and domination, faith and despair. As the centuries passed, Rome itself crumbled, its legions gone, its emperors dust. The Arch of Titus still stood, but the empire that built it was no more. The Jewish people, scattered and wandering, endured. They carried with them not only the scars of defeat, but the memory of resistance, the refusal to vanish, the determination to live as a people even without a land or a temple. The Great Revolt had ended in tragedy, but out of its ashes arose a resilience that no empire could destroy. And so, when we remember the years 66 to 73 CE, we recall not only rebellion and siege and tragedy, but also endurance. We see in the flames of Jerusalem not only destruction, but transformation. The temple fell, but the people survived. The legions marched away, but the memory remained. Masada lies silent beneath the desert sun, yet in its silence it speaks. A voice of defiance carried across millennia, whispering that even in the face of overwhelming might, the spirit of freedom can endure. The great Jewish revolt was crushed by Rome, but it was never erased. It lives in history, in memory, and faith. It reminds us that even the mightiest empires fall, but the story of a people bound by hope and belief can endure forever.